Welcome to the Streets and People podcast, where we explore having more transport options that are less hassle to use. Hosted by Get Around Caboolture, we bring you 3 types of episodes. People and Projects share stories of change. Not Everyone Drives gives voice to non-drivers. Roadwheels 360 unpacks road rules for people outside a car. Music by Grand Project, and let's make our Grand Project reimagining streets made for people. Today we're doing one of our People and Projects episodes. I'm here in the studio with Michael Garber, who I know from the Parking Reform Network, a presentation you gave. We gave this podcast already one go and we didn't feel that the flow was quite right, so we're giving it a second go. So I'm here on Gubbi Gubbi country in Queensland, in Caboolture specifically. Michael, whereabouts are you based and how did you become interested in this whole area?
Hi Wendy, it's great to speak with you again. I am based in metropolitan Denver, Colorado, so on the eastern part of the Rocky Mountains. I became interested in this area because I'm trained as an epidemiologist. So that's somebody who studies the health of populations. I have an interest in public health, and I'm particularly interested in how places can be designed and managed to support population health. I've just come to realize after reading some books and some literature on the topic that parking is one such influence on population health, whose policy can be managed in ways that can likely support population health a bit better.
Yeah, so we're going to be going into the health and well-being of places and how parking impacts the way that people in the community can be healthy or unhealthy, and how parking impacts individual well-being and how that pulls out to the larger community. So when you said you became interested in this whole area of epidemiology, health and well-being and parking, what was it particularly that you were interested in understanding more about?
I don't have a background in urban planning per se, or transportation planning, at least through formal education, but I've done a lot of work trying to understand how we call them like built environment interventions or changes to the way that we design cities through new bike paths, for example, or designing urban places in a more dense manner, how those changes to the built environment can affect population health. In some previous work, I've studied how we can design places to promote biking and make biking safer. I've also done some work on how we can add green space, so places with trees and plants and shrubs to cities, and how that might improve population health. And then in particular in that project, actually, parking seemed like a low-hanging fruit because so many American cities are paved with parking lots. They're rarely entirely full. So it seemed like at least there could be other ways to use that space in a way that would promote population health in a more valuable way.
When I started Get Around Caboolture, I just didn't understand why there was this big conversation about parking, because to me it's like, something at the end of the driveway or out the street, you park out the front or you go to the shops or something. It seemed pretty straightforward. Perhaps you could explain how much land space is taken up by parking and what the impact of that is on well-being and what are the different ways that that impacts.
Sure. So there have been some studies by folks with expertise in planning of parking who have tried to start to quantify the land share, so the amount of area of a given city that parking occupies, citing some specific studies from specific cities. There was a recent study by Lee and colleagues that estimated that San Francisco Bay Area, about 8% of the land is occupied by parking. And San Francisco is a rather dense city in the United States context, so 8% is maybe on the low end. In contrast, there was another study of Los Angeles County done by Chester and colleagues, and to put the number at about 14%. So that's just parking's land share, including off-street paved parking lots, as well as on-street spaces. There's one other study in Phoenix that puts parking land share at about 10%. And then Parking Reform Network has also done some estimation using OpenStreetMap data, and they place the parking land share at about the mid-teens, it seems, based on estimates from about 50 cities. There's a big range, but it seems like between 10 and 20% is typical for an American city. And then in terms of the overall total, there was a study done by Chester and colleagues in 2010. They devised scenarios using different assumptions. The scenarios that they have the most confidence in put the number of spaces in the United States at between about 730 million to 840 million spaces, which when multiplied out in terms of square area is something like 8,000 to 10,000 square miles, which is in the US context almost the size of Massachusetts. I looked up the area of Greater Brisbane. I've never been to Australia. I'd love to go sometime, but apparently Greater Brisbane area is about 15,000 square kilometers. So the total amount of parking in terms of square area in the United States, would occupy about 1.5 times the square area of Greater Brisbane. So quite a bit of space of land that's just occupied by parking lots in addition to on-street parking.
And the thing about a parking lot, you can't actually use it for anything else. That's the big problem. It's not like when you've got, say, a park and you can use it for festivals, you can use it for picnics, you can use it potentially for housing people in tents. It's not necessarily what you want to do, but you can do that. You could also use it to store a car or temporarily if a need arose, or you could put a path through it, you can walk through it. There's a lot of diverse uses, but with a parking lot, it's really just the parking, that's all it does. And it's there and it's unpleasant to be there as a human being. So therefore, it's not used for anything else. You can't put a house on there because, well, a car might need that. That's the idea. So it's the lack of diversity that strikes me as one of the big problems. In terms of the health impacts and what you saw, what did you come across in terms of health impacts?
We wrote up this review paper that proposes various strands of literature. We organized the potential health pathways through a few different avenues. And the first way that parking can influence health is just by covering so much ground with impervious surfaces. And by impervious surface, I mean pavement, asphalt, concrete. Essentially, covering up natural green space with pavement. These impervious surfaces can have consequences for health. So the first important consequence is impervious surfaces can contribute to a phenomenon called the urban heat island effect. Studies have shown that city centers with high amounts of concrete and asphalt and other pavements compared to more rural areas often have about a 2 to 4 degrees Celsius higher temperature during the day. And in some places, and particularly during extreme heat events, the differential between places with a lot of pavement compared with their more rural surrounding areas can be as high as 10 degrees Celsius. There's been some studies that have tried to decompose how much parking specifically might contribute to this effect. So there's a paper by Honey and colleagues that tries to describe this phenomenon in Phoenix. Phoenix, as your listeners may know, is a major metropolitan area in Arizona. It's a really useful place to study this phenomenon because, number one, it has an auto-centric urban design. It's a very car-dependent city. And it's also very, very hot in the summer. So in the average daytime high in Phoenix is 38 degrees Celsius. And they found basically that parking specifically probably contributed about a third of this urban heat effect. So one consequence of all this pavement is simply hotter cities. And as mentioned, heat can have deleterious health consequences, and particularly at high temperatures. So humans essentially just have an upper limit of what they can tolerate. And this can result in things like heat stroke, which people can get dizzy, nauseous, they can have confusion, and ultimately several people get hospitalized for these conditions. This is becoming a more pressing concern globally. So just as one example, in Europe, in the summer of 2022, there was a major heat wave, and some studies have estimated that contributed to about 60,000 deaths. And annually, globally, about 500,000 people die due to extreme heat every year. So to the extent that we can design our cities in a way that mitigates this urban heat effect, it would probably improve health. That's one negative consequence of all this pavement. Another is reduced green space, the converse. Again, by green space, the academic term, but essentially just open areas that have plants, trees, grass, places like parks, and even private residential gardens. There's been an emerging body of literature that has tried to estimate how exposing oneself to nature, to green areas, can benefit health. And studies have shown that there are both short-term and long-term benefits. So in the short term, it can reduce stress and improve short-term mental health. It can provide a reason to be more physically active and to engage in social activities. There have been cohort studies that have studied trying to tease out, comparing people who are habitually exposed to higher amounts of vegetation and green space with those who are not, and controlling for potential confounding variables like income levels. And they found that folks that have more exposure to green space have better mortality outcomes. Or there's some data that suggests that they, for example, don't progress to heart disease as quickly. So it's kind of interesting body of literature on that exposure to green space can improve health. And then another thing that's worth mentioning is when places are paved, they don't manage water as well. All this parking can contribute to flooding and water pollution. One example again in the United States context is Hurricane Harvey in Houston, which was a major tropical storm or hurricane that caused severe flooding in 2017. Researchers have done some studies after all the damage that occurred during this major hurricane, and they estimated that Harris County probably lost about 30% of its wetland from 1992 to 2010, just due to essentially urban sprawl, So certainly parking itself isn't responsible for all of the wetland loss, but Houston is the prototypical Sunbelt city that has been largely designed after World War II and has its car-dependent area with a lot of parking. So parking is probably contributing a considerable amount to that wetland loss and thus the poor flooding management from storms like that. And then flooding, of course, can have all kinds of health consequences. In the worst case scenarios, people can drown, people are displaced from their homes. There's long-term effects in terms of mental health and anxiety. In certain contexts, communicable diseases like cholera can be spread. Yeah, there's just some ways that by covering places with impervious surfaces, we might lead to population health consequences.
So I gave a speech this week to Bribey Island Environmental Group. They invited me to speak and I didn't quite know what to do because I tend not to focus too much on climate because it can be such a divisive issue. When I was writing the speech, what I became aware of is a couple of things. One is that when you have wetland, the water soaks in, it filters the water, and you have trees, which creates shade. The reason we were talking about it is behind the University of the Third Age building, it had been paved over into a huge car park, which was actually largely empty. So exactly the kind of problem that you're talking about. But also, they're an environmental group, so obviously they want to protect fish and animals. But all the tire dust, tires go bald, and that tire dust turns out to be very nasty stuff, and it kills the fish spawn and causes all those other things to run off into creeks and waters, causing all these huge issues. So then there was also another aspect, which was the ambiguous loss of that common space. It looks like it was a gift because we got new parking, but it actually took away land from other uses, as I said before, when I wondered about that psychological impact of having this sense of having to retreat further and further away from public land and not feeling like the land is common anymore. That was another aspect. I know that's not quite what we had planned to talk about, but I thought it was quite an interesting part of social isolation in terms of parking.
I hadn't thought about the psychological effect of losing natural areas as well, but it does seem like that could be part of the issue. And it just brings to mind this kind of framework or concept that I've read about a little bit called One Health, which tries to position the population health of humans together with the health of animals and all different species as a unifying framework. And it turns out that there are many interventions or policies that can benefit both population health and the health of animals or insects or plants. For example, promoting wetland health, maybe adding more vegetation to cities rather than paved parking lots. I think it's important, and especially when there are multiple stakeholders, to try to identify areas. Here in Colorado, we have people interested in native bees and pollinators and improving the health of pollinators. And so to the extent that we can merge the interests of the health of human populations with the health of migratory butterflies or animals, it's a useful way to frame the issue.
So one of the other things I mentioned in the speech that I gave was that on that parking lot of about 50 car spaces, 25 on either side, there could have been about 30 tiny homes on that space. What's your sense of how the housing crisis and parking have been interconnected?
Absolutely. Housing is a major part of this conversation. I would like to recommend a book by Henry Garber called Paved Paradise, as it essentially covers this topic in exhaustive detail. And I know some of your listeners maybe have already read that book, but it's basically a book about how parking affects housing supply. And Donald Shoup, of course, the godfather of parking reform, rest in peace. In his book, he reiterated this point several times as well. He said, the higher the parking requirement, the higher the cost of housing. From the reading that I've done, the way this works is parking requirements can add to the cost of housing because they force builders to build large parking structures that they may not otherwise want to build. They also will cause housing construction to be less dense. And so in terms of housing per square area, by building in a less dense manner, that makes housing more expensive on a per area basis. And parking makes housing less dense because if you require a certain number of spaces next to a housing development, you can't put housing there, you have to put parking there.
I'm just reading The High Cost of Free Parking by Donald Shoup, the second edition, and it is, although it's 750 pages, it's a surprisingly easy read if you have a little bit of knowledge beforehand. So if you're a novice reader, it's not for you. But if you have a little bit of experience with reading mildly technical language, it's actually a delight to read. So I would recommend it. It's very hard to get hold of a copy here that is under $100. But every now and again you can get the jackpot. My husband just got the jackpot and we found one. The other thing is that Paved Paradise, the book that you referred to by Henry Garber, Garber is actually in the Moreton Bay Library, so our listener can borrow that. The impacts of abundant parking supply and parking lots on car dependency and driving. One of the things that I hear is that the more parking you provide, the more people are induced to drive. It's induced demand, because I think everybody does this thing, but where will I park? If it's easy, it encourages driving. So then it just becomes more and more road building and parking, and councils and state and federal governments, it's really affecting their coffers that they can spend on other things and provide other infrastructure. So perhaps you could speak more to that issue of abundant car parking and car dependency.
I do highly recommend that book by Shoup, and he goes through this in some detail as well. Essentially, the impact of parking on car dependency, at least the way I see it and witness it in the United States, is if large parking lots are required to accompany, especially commercial businesses like stores, restaurants, then you're effectively prohibiting density. So a lot of developers may actually like to have their front door immediately adjacent to the street, but because of historical parking requirements, there has to be a certain number of spaces per diner, and oftentimes the parking requirements are very arbitrary and often even laughable. But the result is, if every restaurant has to have X number of parking spaces, then you effectively can't build in a dense way. And then when places are farther apart, it makes the idea of walking or biking or rolling a wheelchair or riding a scooter to these places just impossible for many people. Even if maybe some of these folks would like to walk to dinner or to the grocery shop, they basically can't do it because it's too far away. And even if the distance weren't that far, it's not very pleasant to walk through a bunch of parking lots. We mentioned this term car dependency. People may interpret that to mean an individual level dependency, almost as if a dependency on drugs or alcohol. When I use the term car dependency, it's not an individual level phenomenon, but rather a community level phenomenon where the transportation system is designed in a way that assumes that cars are the dominant way of getting anywhere, and other modes like walking or biking or using public transit are essentially non-existent or impossible or very marginalized. Parking requirements contribute to this by basically banning high density.
Just speaking a little bit more about the impact of actually driving everywhere, having cars everywhere, needing to do all that, what are some of the health consequences? Because I know that car crashes are a big problem, and air pollution, but also obesity and physical inactivity. Do you have the figures on those or understanding of those?
The kind of car-dependent land use and the assumption that all travel must be by car has several negative consequences for public health. The first, as you mentioned, would be traffic crashes. So about 1 million people die each year globally from traffic crashes, and particularly for young people, age 30 or below, it's among the leading causes of death. Often, I think in many countries, it is the leading causes of death. And here in the United States, it competes with guns to be number one, depending on the year. And it's not to say that parking causes all of that, but again, by contributing to this feedback loop of more car-dependent built environments, economically incentivizing driving, it makes driving the more natural option. And then air pollution is another major problem, as you mentioned. So globally, about 385,000 deaths have been estimated to occur per year due to traffic-related air pollution specifically. Beyond just mortality, air pollution can also cause stroke. It contributes to the development of heart disease, other respiratory problems. In addition to air pollution, physical activity or lack thereof is another important way that car-dependent environments can affect population health. So physical activity is an important way for individuals to improve their health. It can result in long-term benefits in terms of decreasing an individual's chance of getting things like cancer or diabetes or heart disease. And then in the short term, there are benefits as well in terms of improved sleep, less anxiety, improved blood pressure. That's not to say that everyone should be biking and walking on every single trip that they take, but when even trips that are short, like less than a mile, so maybe 1.5 kilometers or so, those types of trips in the United States, the default is often to drive. And for many people, a mile walk would be strenuous but doable. I think in particular for those short trips, substituting car trips for physical activity could have a major impact on physical activity at the population level. And then finally, I think it's important to note just that not everybody can drive, not everybody has access to a car. And the ability to be independent in one's life, the ability to move freely through space, to get to work, to school, to healthcare appointments, to grocery stores, that's important for well-being. And so the assumption that all travel, even for short trips, should be made by car, it has negative consequences in terms of justice and equity. There's a recent book by Anna Zavarts called When Driving is Not an Option. She sheds a light on the people for whom the car-dependent transportation system excludes. Another way that car-dependent transportation systems can affect health is just by either facilitating or hindering the ability for people to get from place to place in an independent way. Not everyone can drive. When we assume that every single trip must be taken by car, we're inherently excluding a large portion of the population. In the United States, about a third of the population doesn't have a license. So this includes children and older adults who have aged out of driving, and also folks that have had their license revoked due to involvement with the criminal legal system. Maybe they're undocumented immigrants, maybe they folks with a disability like low vision, or simply people who either choose not to or cannot afford the considerable cost of owning and maintaining a car. So there's recent estimates suggest that it costs about $12,000 per year to own, that's US dollars, to own and maintain a car. I don't have the figure right in front of me right now, but I know new car prices in the United States right now are astronomical, like in the high 40s to low 50s in terms of average, 50,000 US dollars. And then just for context, the median US household income is about 80,000 US dollars. So we're essentially asking people if they'd like to buy a new car that it should be more than half their household income. Again, I just say that because it's a big financial constraint. When we impose this financial constraint on people, it can negatively affect their ability to get from place to place if they are not able to drive for a variety of reasons. Yeah, so that's another avenue to think about how it affects population health, especially through kind of who it affects and who it hinders.
We have something called the Week Without Driving to understand the experience of what Anna Zivitz calls the involuntary non-driver, which is what you're describing there. And it turns out that the largest number of bike riders in Australia, and it may be the same in the US, is children riding to school. So I think that's really interesting. We have this idea that it's the lycra biker, but it's absolutely not. They are the anomaly in the bike riders, but that sticks out, I think, because of its specificity, because that's all they look like they're doing, whereas actually a lot of people are doing other things. So if somebody is in the community and wants to do something about this, what do you recommend? What are some suggested actions?
In terms of individual action, I hesitate a little bit to put too much onus on individual people, as these are collective issues that have been caused by policy choices that have spanned decades. And so I hesitate to kind of tell an individual person who's just trying to get from place to place that they need to drastically change their life, because I think many people are just making do with the transportation system that they have. But at the same time, people can express when folks are voting or engaging in some sort of political action. It might help to think through, or if there's, say, a proposal for a new development and the discussion of parking is on the table, just think beyond the immediate maybe inconvenience of not having a giant abundant parking lot in which to park your car, and think about the larger population health consequences of excess parking and how that space might be used in a different way to promote population health.
And I also think just not driving so much is also good. If you can ride a bike or walk, then it's good to take that option. It's not always pleasant. I mean, here it's very car dependent and the footpath quality is pretty poor. It is what it is, but I think that definitely helps. So say you're at the bottom of the food chain at council or state government and you would love to reduce the amount of free parking that's available, or take on parking reform, or introduce this topic of well-being in parking. What are some ideas that you have there?
To go back to the Anna Zivitz book, it's thinking about every person in the population and how they might get around. If 2/3 of people drive and 1/3 of people don't drive, maybe you still should plan a bit for accommodating parking, but also think carefully about how all this abundant parking might be actually harming folks who can't drive. So I think having in mind the full population distribution, meaning like all different types of people from different backgrounds and different income levels, when designing a policy is really important. And don't just assume that, well, everyone drives, so we should put this huge parking lot here, because that's what people want.
So this has been really nice to have a bit of an overview about a few different aspects, because I think one of the things that I didn't realize is how much land is taken up by parking. And it's only since I've started going, that space could be used for something else. That space used to be a wetland. That space actually isn't used much by cars at all. So this kind of squeeze that we've now got in our society because of parking, that just took me a long time to register. And I think that's where that book by Henry Garber, Paved Paradise, which is in the library, really puts it into perspective. So we've come to the end. Is there anything else that you think I should have asked? Any final comments, any closing remarks, anything else you would like to add?
Nothing comes to mind. I think we've covered quite a bit. Thank you so much. And thank you for having me.
Yeah, I think it was good. It's good to bring in the health and well-being of parking, because I'm a complete health nut, and actually just me riding to wherever I go because I don't have a car. I mean, I've done my will and testament and my advanced care directive, which is in the hospital, because of the way that our urban spaces are designed. People come out of car parks, they've got those fences and they can't see out, and the way that the car park is designed, they come down from high and onto a footpath. I'm going at whatever speed on the footpath. I've almost been hit, or at particular intersections where the red arrow is on but people don't watch that. And so I think that's another one about the expectation of car dependence as well. It's made me much more aware from certainly car crash perspectives.
Yeah, absolutely. We shouldn't be asking you to sacrifice your health just to get around by bike or by walking. It should be something that's promoted by urban design, not a personal sacrifice that you have to make for your own choices.
Yeah, definitely. All right. Well, thank you very much, Michael. Thank you for coming on again. So it's very much appreciated. And I think it's been a really good introduction to just touch on a couple of the health issues of car dependence and also parking and how that plays a huge role. So thank you very much for coming on the show.
Thanks for having me, Wendy.
Thank you for listening to the Streets and People podcast. If you enjoyed this episode, share it with someone who'd find it helpful. Your small action could make a big difference. We're on all the usual podcasting platforms, so don't miss a single story. To find out what else we do, check out getaroundcaboolture.au. Until next time, remember, there's more than one way to get where you're going. Keep moving, keep listening, and keep imagining streets made for people.